Yeah, boy.
Okay, I'm going to try something today that I've never done before. Got this 2019 4runner, 30,000-ish miles, and it has a bad left front shock. It's leaking. So, and it's making noise, my wife said. So we're going to get this changed. I'm going to try something different today I've never done in the past. 30 plus years of working on my own stuff. I've changed lots of struts and lots of shocks, spring compressors, all that stuff. Had a couple different models. And why not try something different today where we actually use the vehicle as a spring compressor? Okay, that's what the suspension does. It compresses springs, right? That's what it does. We're going to try to use that, the lower control arm, leave the lower shock bolted on, unbolt the top part of the shock, compress the spring with the jack underneath. Of course, we're going to compress the spring and take the top bolt off and then lower the A-arm and see if that's enough to unload the spring completely and then just pull the shock out. Now, I think the spring's going to fall out anyway, but the goal is to not use a spring compressor tool and see if we can just use this, do this with the A-arm, the control arm is what I mean, and the jack. Okay? Never done this before. Don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to find out. All right, let's get in the garage and get started. Okay, so here's the tools, all the tools that it took for this job. 10 millimeter and 12 millimeter 3/8 drive with little electric impact just to take off the front spoiler or the front splash guard, and then a small crescent just to hold the top of the shock, 17 millimeter long arm, 17 millimeter just to break that upper old nut loose, the factory nut, 19 millimeter. This I used to install the top nut on the new shocks because it comes with a bigger nut. Okay. 19 millimeter half-inch socket, 22 millimeter half-inch socket, okay? And that was just to relocate the snap rings and also to help me kind of maneuver the ball joint mount around just to get it to line up when we were putting the ball joint mount back onto the knuckle. And then electric impact makes it nice. You don't have to have that, of course. That just makes removing the bolts a little faster and a little smoother. And then, of course, some lighting. This is just for marking the cams for the alignment, and so you want to make sure that you're not knocking those out of alignment when you do loosen those lower inner control arm bolts. And you have to do that whether you're doing it with a spring compressor tool and you're using the spring compressor. You still have to lower those further than they'll droop out. So you have to loosen those bolts enough that the lower control arm will droop out enough to get the whole thing out. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it this way, using the vehicle as a spring compressor or using a spring compressor tool, you still have to do that. So, and then of course a little chisel just to mark, make a little punch mark on the side of the cam, not on the cam itself, but on the side of the cam, and a little hammer to do that. That's it. And of course you need jack stands and a jack. And torque wrench. We got 3 14 millimeters here, here, and here holding the top of the shock tower on. See, we have the 17 millimeter here that actually holds the tension on the spring here. And this is what holds the other side of the spring, of course. This is a 19 millimeter here. It looks like we might have to back it up with a wrench over there. And there's a couple 19 millimeter bolts here. And what you're doing here is, this is obviously the lower ball joint, right? And so this is a ball joint kind of locator, and it separates right here and then right here on the other side as well. Okay, so if you pull this 19 millimeter bolt here and this one right here, this whole thing will fall away. So you're not loosening your ball joint. Okay, you're just loosening the mounts. And this is how I did it on my Tundra, my 2002 Tundra, a couple times when I changed struts on that. We had that truck for 250,000 miles, so we did this a few times. Even changed CV axles once on it. So it was a good truck. And it was still running when we sold it. Now we're going to put the jack under this before we pull this last bolt out. So now we're going to loosen this top center nut, and hopefully then the jack will be able to lower that and lower that arm down to the ground. Okay, so we're using a 17 millimeter long arm and then just an adjustable wrench to hold the top part right there. Breaking it loose with this. Now 17mm ratcheter. Now, before we loosen that nut all the way, I want to make sure that the jack is tight against the bottom of this lower control arm right here. So we're going to put a little bit of tension on it. Not going to raise the vehicle off the jack stands, but just enough to kind of make sure that it's tight. Make sure the jack handle is nice and tight so that it won't let off or slip. Now, the good part about this tells me the tension's off of it, right? Because I'm still loosening it, but it's unthreading by hand. That means the spring isn't trying to pull that down and pull it out. Okay, so that's good. Now what we might do just for safety here is just put a few turns on that. Leave that little bit of gap there. Okay, everything's loose there. We're going to come down here and lower this. And as I lower it, let's watch that gap right there. Okay, back underneath the fender, we're going to pull this nut off here. Pull the washer off. Sorry, I know it's hard to see with that light back there. Pull the rubber bumper off. Maybe. Okay, it's nice and clean up there now. Okay, here goes. We're going to lower the jack now. Hold on to your butts. That was anticlimactic. Spring tension can't be all the way off, is it? No, I'm going to have to loosen these stupid lower arms. I didn't want to have to do that. Okay, this one actually has a little hash mark you can feel with your fingernail in it, so I just made a little mark in the middle of it and then made a mark here on the cam. Okay, good. Okay, so here we just made a little chisel mark like that because there's no mark on this, and this just makes me feel a little bit better that it can be lined up right with that. Yep. Now up here, rubber bumper got left, and we can just leave it there. In the directions here, you know, this isn't telling you how the parts go back together, but you just got to kind of pay attention to how your originals come off and keep the parts in order, and then you can get it back together, of course, because the instructions here don't talk about that. So this is just explaining the clip height and what it does to your ride height. So the lowest clip position, of course, is normal ride height. That's your factory shock setting, or factory shock height rather. If you put it at the second position, that will give you 0.85 inch average lift. The third position is 1.75 inch, and fourth position is 2.5 inch average. So You know, I'm not going to put it way up here. I'd like to. I've done that in the past on my Toyota Tundra. I did that, and it was awesome. It had a good ride height. It actually lifted the front end a little bit higher than the back end. It was kind of pre-runner style. It was kind of cool. But I think that really does increase the angle on the front CV axles. So I think that's going to increase the wear on those, maybe accelerate the wear. That's just my opinion. But I'm going to just put it on the second position here, 0.85 inch, just to give it a little bit of change. Okay, now this is what comes in the bag with the shock. There's a new collar, there's a new nylon lock nut, there's a nylon insert there. That's cool. And this is part number for this 2019 4runner, 24-196499. Now we want to be careful here that we don't overbend this or overstretch it, right? Okay, we got it out of the groove. We're just going to slide it up here. The second position. Looks like it's in nicely. Let's just slide it around, make sure it slides around easily. Yep, looks like it's engaged. Okay, good. Okay, let's just see what the rebound is like on these. Okay, the Bilstein's definitely stiffer. They're both bottomed out. Here we go. Okay, so the factory one took more than twice as long. Good deal. Let's get these in. Okay, first thing we're going to do is put on the new parts. We're going to get rid of this little retainer. Slide this boot off. Okay, we've got our clip set in the second position there. We're going to take this piece, slide it on, wide part down. Okay. Then we can go ahead and slide our boot back on, and then this can go on now too. Okay, we'll set our spring in place. It's important to get this engaged where the spring is lined up with this notch. Okay, like that. We index this down here, but it's probably going to move, so we need to make sure we recheck that after we get it up in position. You're going to check for the rubber washer. It's still there. It hasn't fallen out. That's good. Okay, so what we did was we just put the nut in the top there just to hold it in place. I can't push it any farther up, so we're going to use the fulcrum effect of the lower control arm down here to push up on this, to get it pushed up inside. Once we get that up inside, then we'll put these on right here. Okay. Okay. All right, now what we need to do is keep this ball joint bracket lined up as we jack this up. We know it's going to line up there, so because the top of the shock's already in the hole. It looks like the spring is engaged well in the collar, and going up the spring here to the top, it looks like the spring's engaged well within the rubber up here. So, and you can see that the nut got pushed up high, so that's awesome. Just what we needed. And we're going to take the nut off. We're going to put the rubber bumper on. Then we're going to put the rubber or the metal washer with the concave side down. And then we'll make sure we put the nylon lock nut with the nylon to the top, of course. To get that up there, we're going to snug that down and see if we can't pull this up a little bit further here. Now that could be turning the top, it could be turning the whole threaded shaft, right? But it looks like it's not. That seems to be stationary right there. So we're going to keep running this down. Now it's starting to turn it, so I'll have to put a wrench on it. Okay, so we got the nut snug. This rubber's starting to squish out a little bit here, so we're going to stop right there. We don't want to crush the rubber, right? So it's starting to just bulge out a little bit. We're going to stop there. And now when we weight the vehicle, that's going to compress the spring up, right? And that might push this up higher. This might loosen up. So after we put the tires on, put the wheels on, put the tires on, put it back on the ground, we need to come back sure and make sure this isn't loose or clunking. And then when we drive it, we need to make sure when it droops out that we don't hear a clunk either, because that could be this loose right here. The other reason you want to mark your alignment in a couple different positions is because when you loosen these bolts to drop this part right here, you might mess up the alignment. This cam might move. So you want to make sure it doesn't move. So just mark it, and then you know. It's easy to make a straight line across there like I did and mark a solid piece that you can reference it against. There's probably other indexing marks on here that you could use that would make it a little easier. So I marked it, a little arrow at the top of that piece of metal, black piece of metal right there. I marked it right there with the line across. Okay, now we're going to jack it up a little bit higher here and get the ball joint lined back up. Okay, so this moves around pretty easily by hand. It's not quite lining up though. Let's try to pull it that way just a little bit and see if that doesn't make a difference. Okay, that got it. Well, we'll just run it all the way by hand. Okay, good. Now we can start torquing stuff down. Okay, so these lower bolts, these two bolts we just put in that hold the ball joint mount in place, they're 118 foot-pounds. So we're going to roll this up to foot-pounds here. Okay, there's that one. Make sure that's not going to interfere there. Okay. Okay, so this lower shock bolt needs to be torqued to 70 foot-pounds. Okay, and these we torqued to 129 foot-pounds. Okay, hasn't moved either, looks good. Now, a couple problems, potential problems that I can see with doing it this way. Of course, you're taking your own risk if you're going to do something vastly different than the way it's normally done, like I'm doing here. But I'm trying to manage that by knowing that, number one, I'm not going to get this torque to 18 foot-pounds like the manual says. And the other thing is, when we're looking at the vehicle from the front here, you know, I've got it on big jack stands there and there on the frame. I have these jack stands in the middle that are almost touching the frame that are backing it up should one of these fail and it comes straight down. The risk is jacking up this side unweights this side of the vehicle as you're jacking this A-arm up. So I could see the vehicle move just a little bit as I was jacking this up to get that nut tightened up there at the top of the shock. And that could potentially shift the whole vehicle and cause it to fall. Okay, so that's definitely a risk, and a falling vehicle is no joke, right? You can die from that. So this is a risk I'm taking. You're taking your own risk if you're doing it like this. This is just an example of how I'm doing it without a spring compressor tool. Spring compressor tools have their own risks. Some of the cheaper ones are kind of scary. And there's some videos you can see on YouTube of them failing. So that's risky too. You know, if you have a professional one, that anytime a spring is under tension, you're worried about that, right? So that can happen. So let's just look at our jack stands here. You know, I don't see them leaning. They haven't shifted
As far as the frame goes, the jack stands are still centered on the frame like I left them. And so I feel safe about that, but you got to be careful. Okay, so I got to double check everything. I'm going to do the other side, and then I'm going to come back to this side and retorque everything. Just put the torque wrench on with the torque specs just to make sure that I'm happy with everything I took off. So I've got 2 bolts down here I took off. I had the bolt here. I had these that I loosened, that one and this one, those cams that I marked there and there, there and there, and to make sure. And then this one I'm having to hand tighten right here because I didn't take these off, this part of the upper shock tower off right here. Okay. So once I'm done here, I'm going to leave this wheel off for now. I'm going to come back over, retorque everything, make sure that all the bolts that I took off, I'm double checking and triple checking to make sure I torque them to the correct specification, and also that I didn't miss anything, okay? That I didn't leave anything off, that nothing's out of whack, out of alignment. So we're going to come back and double check all the torque specs. Obviously I can't check this one, but once I put the vehicle weight on the ground, I want to come back and make sure that this top nut isn't loose here and that the rubber hasn't been unloaded too much. So we're going to be careful of that we don't over torque it here or under torque it. We're going to tighten it so that the rubber just begins to squish out, so that there's tension on the rubber, but it just begins to squish out. What this means is this will loosen over time as the rubber gets old and cracked, and so this will start loosening, and you may hear a popping noise in your suspension as you're bouncing over a speed bump or something. And then this is something to check, because the threads on the inside of this shaft here, where this nut goes on, if these rubbers start to decompose over time and they kind of squish down, this can get loose, and those threads can kind of make a knocking sound as they go up inside this little piece of metal right here, or a popping sound. So that's something that happened to my Dodge Diesel. It started popping and making a noise, and I was all over the suspension thinking it was a suspension noise, and it turned out to just be a loose top shock nut. So that was super annoying that happened. Oh, and that loose top shock nut was on from my factory shocks. But one of them had gone bad like this one had, and it must have had a lot of resistance, so it started wearing out the rubber. The rubber started taking a lot of the up and down stress. And then eventually the rubber started breaking down, and then the shock started moving up and down inside. The shock shaft did inside this tower right here, and then yeah, started making noise. Okay, let's see if we can go down a little bit further here. Okay, so it's pretty low. The weight is off the spring. Okay, so we're just going to stop there. Make sure that's tight there. Good. Let's pull this nut off. Let's pull this bolt out. Okay. And now, let's see if we can pull the shock out. Okay, good. There's the lower washer. There's the spring. We might wash this a little bit since it's a little greasy. And, you know, we're just going to check the CV boots here while we're here. Make sure they look okay. There's no splits, cracks, grease coming out. There's no oil leak from underneath there. Okay, this is going to be upside down. You can see the shock that's blown, and it's a little easier to compress. And those are awfully slow, aren't they?
Okay, well I guess I should have measured it on the front end to see really how much it really did raise it, but the bottom line is measuring it doesn't equate looks. So, you know, the gap between the tire and the fender is the same now, or almost the same, and I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's a good compromise. It shouldn't stress the CV axles too much. So, you know, I think if I do this again, I would do it a little bit differently, where I would leave one tire on and just jack up one side at a time, and then, you know, jack it up,
emergency brake on, keep this other tire on the ground. Jack stands under. If I have an extra jack, I'm going to keep it under there on another hard spot. So if it does slip or fall, I've got several things under there to keep it from falling. So I'm not getting under this vehicle except to mark the cam lobes for the alignment to make sure the cam lobes stay in alignment. Okay, so basically that's the only reason I'm getting under this. So lots of jack stands, redundancy, extra jack is always in order. And keep that other tire on the ground. Do this one. Hopefully it'll droop out enough. I think it probably will because I didn't have to drop it super, super far. And you can get one side pretty high up in the air but with keeping this other tire on the ground. And then doing that one side, getting it all done, tire back on the ground, retorqued, torque lug nuts, and then go back to the other side. And I think I'm going to do that in the future. Keep one tire on like that.
So my ASE mechanic buddy was telling me that I want to make sure to not torque the lower control arm bolts, the inner lower control arm cross bolts, with the vehicle in the air, with the lower control arms drooped out like this. The vehicle needs to be on flat ground with the suspension in the rear and the front evenly weighted, and then torque them down. Okay, so what I'm doing is I have it on level ground now. I'm loosening the bolts. I'm doing the passenger side first, and then I'm loosening them enough to make sure they're loose and all the tension's off of them, and then I'm tightening them back down. Now it's important to mark them because I'll show you why. It just saved me. And honestly, I'm not going to do an alignment. This has 30,000 miles on it. We're probably going to be changing these tires in the next 10,000 miles anyway, or 15,000 miles, maybe 20 at the very most. So if they do wear unevenly, I don't care too much because they're going to get changed soon anyway. So I'm just trying to maintain the alignment that I have. And so right here, my black mark is right at the top of my fingernail, right there. And you can see the black mark on the cam. So it moved up when I loosened this bolt right here. Okay. So now what we're going to do is realign that. And the alignment may not look straight from where you're at. I'm looking straight onto it. But the camera's a little bit lower than where I'm looking. So we're just going to bring the cam back down. Well, that's a little too far, isn't it? Almost there. Right there. Okay. So my line matches my line. My arrow matches the top of that piece of metal right there where my fingernail is. So that's perfect. Now I'm going to snug this down. I'm not torquing it with this, but I want to put some tension on it to hold it in place. Then where I marked these inner ones earlier, I'm going to check with my mirror and just see. Make sure that my alignment hasn't moved there. Yeah, it's perfectly lined up. My black mark matches my black mark. So the inner cam is good as well. So I can go ahead and torque this one down with the torque wrench, and then we'll move on to the front. So I loosened the front one and the back one. I don't know if I can do them individually or if I need to do them both at the same time, but I went ahead and did them both at the same time. I loosened them both just to make sure. I feel a little safer doing that, and then we'll go ahead and get this one torqued down, then we'll move to the front one, make sure it hasn't moved, and then get it torqued down. Okay, so the reason he said to do that is because if you torque the lower control arms with the front end up in the air and the control arms drooped out at the maximum of the shock travel, then what that does is the cross bolts, as they squeeze in, they compress the rubber bushing, and the rubber bushing expands inside the lower control arm sleeve, I guess. I don't know what word would be better for that, but it expands inside there and sort of jams it. And that limits the articulation of the control arm, so that as the control arm goes up and down, it actually twists the rubber inside and deforms the rubber. So the rubber isn't actually turning inside. It's not turning on the bolt. And we know that, or maybe a little bit, but not very much. But we know that because when we went to droop out the lower control arms to take the shock out, we had to loosen those cross bolts to get it to droop out fully. And so that explains why that's happening. So what happens is if you torque them down with the
control arm fully drooped out, then it jams the rubber there, and then it binds the rubber, and then it'll make the suspension a lot stiffer. And that may be why people are saying it takes a couple weeks or a few weeks for the shocks to wear in and to start feeling smooth, because that may actually take the rubber that long to work its way around. And maybe it never works around, or maybe it does. I don't know which one is the truth, but so the idea is to torque them with it on level ground, with the weight of the vehicle equally on the front and the back of the vehicle, on the front and back axles, and then torque them down. And then so that the limitation, then it'll have range of motion going up and range of motion going down, basically like it's supposed to. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're retorquing this. It's a little bit of a pain, but it's the right thing to do. So